we want to talk about gentleness. Isn't it funny how we often connect gentleness, when we talk about that word, with a certain type of personality? And anyone who doesn't fit that stereotype obviously isn't gentle, right? I mean, they're a gentle soul. Often we look at people who speak in hushed tones and, quiet voice and have a calm demeanor. I'm so not that. Dave, some of you may be finding this ironic that Dave's preaching on gentleness, but it's really going to be good today. Okay, we're going to really take a journey here. Speaking of, again, not fitting the stereotype, I came across this story. At St. Francis High School in La Canada, California, math teacher Jim O'Connor is known for his tough, no-nonsense approach to algebra, pushing his students, all boys, into shape. O'Connor, a Vietnam vet, told CBS News, "It drives me crazy when people say school should be fun. I mean, we should be nice to the students, but you can't always make school fun." Pat McGoldrick, a grade 12 student at St. Francis, says, "Until people get used to him, they think he's really mean." But all that changed for Pat and his classmates when they visited Los Angeles Children's Hospital to recruit blood donors for a blood drive they were organizing. When the boys mentioned where they went to school, they were immediately, by the hospital staff, met with awe. The hospital staff said things like, "Oh, so you must know Jim O'Connor. Are you fortunate enough for him to teach you? Isn't he just wonderful?" The boys were stunned. And if they were being honest, a little confused about the man they thought they knew. The confusion started to get cleared up when they saw a plaque in the hospital for all-time blood donors. Who was at the top of the list? Teacher Jim O'Connor. A universal blood donor type, O negative. I didn't know this, but O negative is the universal blood donor type. O'Connor has donated a total, now get a load of this, and this is an American story, so 72 gallons of blood and platelets since 1989, surely saving countless of lives along the way. But there was more that the boys learned that day. Jim O'Connor, who never married or had children of his own, volunteers 3 days a week holding and rocking sick and dying babies when their parents can't be there. O'Connor says of the babies, "I don't want to see them alone. You just can't do that to them." O'Connor's students were blown away. Their tough teacher, indeed, had a gentle and caring heart. Again, when we think of gentleness, what comes to mind? On first blink, we may default to images of syrupy sweetness and softness. We may perceive it as effeminate or a personality disposition we suspect that really doesn't get us far in a highly competitive world. But gentleness, as described in the Bible, is a Christ-like character trait for those being filled with the Spirit of God. Jesus gives us an invitation, actually, where he says, "Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest." But in this invitation, Jesus reminds us that as he invites us to experience rest in him, he says he is gentle, and humble in heart. Rest for our souls includes learning the way of gentleness from our Savior. Scripture shows us God is far less interested in your results than the person you are becoming. So let me ask you, as we continue on this belief journey, and we're almost to the end of it, what kind of person are you becoming? And today, we need to consider this quality, this soul quality of gentleness. Now, our key verse is taken from Philippians 4:5. So let's bring that up. Actually, it's a simple verse. I love it when we can just sort of grab a big idea with just sort of like two little sentences. And when people say, "I can't memorize the Bible," I go, come on, you can memorize this. Okay, so let's say it together. "Let your gentleness be evident to all. The Lord is near." Philippians 4:5. Let's say it one more time. "Let your gentleness be evident to all. The Lord is near." Philippians 4:5. Okay, so let's talk about your gentleness being evident. Today, as we talk about letting our gentleness be evident, I want us to sort of do a little bit of a deeper dive on this idea of gentleness. Now, there's a couple of different words, actually, that are used again in the Greek New Testament that's been translated into our English language to describe the word gentleness. And I'm going to sort of zero in on one of those key words as we kind of get our head a bigger vision of gentleness. Because again, we got to keep pushing away this idea that gentleness is hushed tones or acting with hurt feelings. Oh, don't get them upset because they're too gentle. And we often, again, are perceiving it as weakness, whereas gentleness in the Bible is actually a real strength of character. So let's look at 3 descriptions today about what gentleness is. First of all, if we're going to journey to gentleness is not having, you got blanks there so you can fill them in. That should, hopefully, if you don't have an outline, I apologize, we ran out. Gentleness is not having half-baked opinions, but sees the whole context. Okay, so the first thing we want to help you understand about the biblical idea of gentleness is that you are not always insisting, now listen carefully, on every right of letter of law or custom. You understand what is expected. You understand the guidelines. You understand the standards. But you navigate those standards not with an unbending strictness, but instead are merciful and tolerant. Now listen, this is gentleness of slight deviations. In other words, you attempt to thoughtfully see the whole context rather than simply state in a half-baked way, well, that's the rule. That's what they told me to do. I can't do anything else for you. You strive to see the intent behind the rule and make adjustments as needed. Okay, so that's the first part of gentleness. You're thinking wisely as you seek to gently address people. James 3:17 catches this idea of wise thinking with gentleness. Listen to this, and it's not on the screen, so just the wisdom that comes from above, writes James, is first of all pure, but catch this, it's also peace-loving and gentle at all times. See, there's a connection between wisdom and gentleness. For example, for those of you who are professors, we do have a few here in our audience here today. You have stated to your class that you are teaching that your deadline for papers is 12 noon, 12:00, 12:00. Someone, a student who's been struggling, delivers their paper at 12:07. What is the right response? And what is the right and gentle response? I remember, actually, I'll share a personal story here for a moment. I remember when my daughter was in a provincial speech contest many moons ago. And I remember when she went in, she was informed there would be 2 parts to this provincial speech competition. She was in grade 10, and she was up against grade 11 and 12 students as well. And there would be this main speech, which would take up the majority of the competition for each of the students competing. And there would also be a spontaneous question asked to each of the speech students as part of their response, just see how they could speak spontaneously. Well, I'm her dad and everything, but I have to admit she did really, 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 really well in her main speech. If I was honest, I said she blew everybody else out of the water, but that's just me, I'm her dad. But then it came time for the spontaneous question. And I can still remember this as like it was like yesterday. There she was in the auditorium at St. Thomas University at the time. And her question came from a quote based on Albert Einstein, dealing with technology's impact on today's society. It was a quite convoluted quote. But she was asked if she agreed or disagreed with Albert Einstein, one of the most brilliant minds of all time. In her moment of confusion, she chose to disagree. And in the next few minutes, she began to speak spontaneously in a confused way. She panicked, she got confused, and it was painful. I remember afterwards, as the judges went out, they took an awful long time to assess who really was going to place in first, second, and third in the competition. Like I said, I knew Megan was at the top of the group with the main speech, but I knew she was dead last when it came to her spontaneous part. So the main judge came up to deliver who had finished in first, second, and third, and he stated their dilemma was actually with Megan's presentation. He summed it up by saying that the main speech was the primary goal of this provincial competition, and in light of that, Megan was rewarded for her efforts in that high school provincial speech contest. Yeah, she took first place. I can remember, though, I only tell this story, besides bragging on my own kid for a moment. I tell that story because it put the judges in this dilemma to see the whole context in order to make a gentle decision. Because there was some saying, well, this is the rule, and this is how you do it. And there were a few parents, I think, that were in that mode. But it required to see the whole context rather than just looking at half the picture. You know, when we begin to grasp context, we become gentle. We avoid becoming someone who wants an unbendable rule of law and tradition without being tempered by graciousness, mercy, or compassion. We will avoid becoming someone who lacks empathy and wisdom when evaluating what is just. You know, I think of that well-known verse in Micah 6:8. What does the Lord require of you? Now notice this, to act justly and to love mercy. It requires gentleness to be able to hold those two together. Gentleness wisely includes mercy with what is right and just. Well, that's the first thing. We're going to be gentle. We see context. The second thing that we're going to do if we're going to show gentleness is it's not being heartless, but considers the person. You know, when we see people the way God sees people, we will find the best response always includes gentleness. Wisdom literature, the Bible, encourages us with this instruction. In Proverbs 15:1, we hear, a gentle answer turns away wrath, but a harsh word stirs up anger. In our words with others, gentleness paves the way to deeper understanding because you're treating others with respect. Now, let me ask you this. How do you respond when you're encountering someone who's coming across as heartless, harsh, and with no empathy to your situation? Bottom line, what happens? Walls go up. Loving people means we take time to put ourselves in other people's shoes. And by doing so, we are practicing gentleness because we're considering the other person. We are beginning to feel what they're feeling. Do to others, Jesus teaches us, as you would have them do to you. You put yourself in the other person's place. Because again, rather than being heartless, you think, you consider the other person. Philip Yancey shares a story from his book, Vanishing Grace, that I think illustrates this aspect of gentleness when we truly consider the other person. Philip Yancey shares this. He says, once I was speaking on the topic of grace in Toronto. I asked the audience about their own experiences conveying grace to others. One woman shocked us all. She said, I feel called to minister to telemarketers. I want you to hear that. My calling is to minister to telemarketers. You know, the kind who call at inconvenient hours, usually around supper time, and deliver their spiel before you can say a word. Immediately, I flash back to the times, Yancey shares, how I responded rudely or simply hung up. But then she continued her story. She says, all day long, these sales callers hear people curse at them and slam the phone down in their ear. I have chosen to listen attentively to their pitch, then I try to respond kindly, though I almost never buy what they're selling. Instead, I ask about their personal life and whether they have any concerns I can pray for. Often they ask me to pray with them over the phone, and sometimes they are in tears. You see, I do this because they're people, after all, probably underpaid, and they're surprised when someone treats them with a common, gentle courtesy. Some are saying, oh my goodness, I got a new ministry right now. Ministry to telemarketers. Got to be gentle. So this story reminds us that gentleness is not a heartless, harsh response, but really thinks about the other person. This is what it means to let your gentleness be evident to all, including telemarketers. Okay, so far we've seen that gentleness is not being half-baked in your thinking, but you see the whole context. And secondly, gentleness is not being heartless or harsh, but rather you take in consideration the person in front of you or people in front of you. Well, let's go on to the next one. Gentleness is not being hot-headed, but shows restraint in its response. As much as gentleness involves thoughtful understanding of the context and considering the other person or persons, ultimately comes down to our response. You know, when did this happen? Was it 2 weeks ago we had our EEP, our emergency evacuation plan rehearsed? We had people who participated in that. Oh, good. Okay, so some of you know what to do. Please tell the others. Now here's the thing. Linda, our general manager of ministries, and Sarah, our pastor of children and families, was actually sitting down with Jamie Hawkins and was talking to about other emergency type of situations that can occur in churches. And he said that when people are in really intense, dangerous, emotional situations, there are 3 responses when they are in those intense situations. And they all start with F, okay? They either fight, flight, or freeze. They either fight, flight, or freeze. And I got thinking about that, especially about even when we're in not maybe really dangerous, external situations, but when we are in, let's be honest, emotional, conflictual, tough moments, right, with people. And I got looking at everybody, and I got thinking, yeah, those people, they just want to take off. They're flighters. And then I look at others and I go, yeah, like when they get into conflict with other people or there's intensity or there's disagreement, they're freezers. They just freeze. They just like go blank-eyed, are you there? And then there's others that are like fighters. You get them into conflict and they just, start to fight. And again, the question is, which one are you? Now I've shared with you, I said, I think I'm a fighter. And people go, no. Really, Dave? Really? It took you that long to get that one figured out? Yes, Evelyn, okay. Evelyn's losing it over there. Okay. She used to be on my staff way too long. She knows too much about me. But the point is, we all have a default. I can pick out the fighters in this room. I know I met some of you in our conversations. I picked out the ones who just take off. I get that. I know I can see the flighters. And I even know some of you are freezers. You don't do anything. You just shut down. You don't give any response. Now here's the question. I think what we have to understand is that all those are honest, emotional responses. But in the long run, and I want you to hear this, they are immature emotional responses that are not loving and do not demonstrate gentleness to other people. I think we often think gentleness means weakness, when in fact it means strength under control. Gentleness always focuses on how love can be experienced in that moment. And being considerate of others, gracious and kind, listen, requires courageous, heroic strength to choose your response, not just to default to your response. Choose your response. Ask for God's strength in that. In other words, often we need to both restrain, and if we had a lot more time for more blanks, I would add, and retrain our response. We need to restrain and even retrain our responses. Let me just take you to the story of Jesus and Peter. I think of Jesus' encounter with Peter after his resurrection. Here is Jesus who had defeated death and Satan. He had conquered the grave. He was Lord of all. All authority in heaven and earth had been given to him at this point. And he knew Peter, though, had denied him. And how did he treat Peter? You need to go to John chapter 21 if you're making notes and just reread that encounter. And I always find it fascinating. The more you read something, the more you start to pick out the details and understand what's going on. Because Jesus is now meeting Peter on the shore of Galilee, and he's around a fire and some fish is being cooked. And the last time Peter had seen Jesus was he was standing around a fire as Jesus was being led into a trial. Don't you think that wasn't written by the author to make the connection? And I can't help but think Peter's saying, I'm standing around a fire again, and I'm looking at Jesus again. The last time I said I wasn't going to deny him, and I did deny him. And I not only just didn't deny him once, I denied him 3 times. And by the time I got to the 3rd denial, I was cursing and swearing and everything, telling everyone I didn't know Jesus. And now I'm standing in front of the risen Lord. Oh man, this is not going to go down good. And how does Jesus speak to Peter in that moment? The word gentle is never used in that story, but it has gentle slathered all over it. Because all Jesus does, he looks at Peter and says, Peter, I've got a question to ask you. Do you love me? Well, Peter says, I love you, Lord. Well, then feed my sheep. Peter, got another question to ask you. Do you love me? Oh, Jesus, I love you. Well, then feed my sheep. But Peter, I got to ask you one more time. Oh, there's that 3 times. Peter, do you love me? What if Jesus had came in going, hey, thanks for the extra bass there, appreciate that. Hey, you know who I am. Beat death, beat Satan, heaven and earth, I'm the authority man. Now, Peter, you get to the back of the line right now. I'm talking to everybody else. What if Jesus had responded to Peter harshly? What if he had corrected Peter in a harsh, demanding way? What if Jesus had responded with a fight, flight, or freeze approach? But I want you to catch this. Gentleness is all about the how as well. How he restored Peter is what gentleness is all about. And how you and I live and work and serve with others is where our restrained response makes all the difference. This is true for all believers, but I think this is true especially for leadership. Paul says this to Timothy. He says, here's a trustworthy saying, Timothy. Whoever aspires to be an overseer desires a noble task. And then he starts to list all the qualities of what an overseer of God's church is all about. And one of the qualities he says is this: he is not violent, she is not violent, but gentle. Not violent, but gentle. We may feel the urge to lash out. We really do. Haven't you had those moments where you just want to go, oh, I just so want to let go right now. Oh, I just so want to let go. But don't we realize that when we let go, in the end, it achieves so little? Here's a story about how a gentle response changes the moment when, now catch this, when things can't get changed. Okay? Ed and his wife, Barb, are from Ann Arbor, Michigan. The Waltz's daughter, Deb, has cerebral palsy. Barb Waltz had hoped that Deb would walk one day. After performing a battery test, the first doctor led Ed and Barb into a small conference room where he bluntly laid out for them what they could expect. In a tone that was cold and emotionally disconnected from his patient, the doctor said, listen, it is extremely unlikely that your daughter will ever walk. Still in a state of shock from the devastating news, Barb asked, what kind of shoes should I buy for my daughter then? She was thinking about some special corrective shoes or perhaps shoes connected to a brace. Without softening the blow, the doctor retorted, listen, buy her whatever you want to buy her. Buy her whatever kind of shoes you want, because she will not be using them to walk. And with that, he quickly left the room, where Barb burst into tears. Several months later, the family met with another doctor. And this time, the entire scene felt different, though. Ed said, my wife asked this new doctor essentially the same question she had asked the first one. She was still wondering if there was anything we could do that might enable our daughter to take just a few steps with her cerebral palsy. And the doctor paused for a moment thinking. Then he looked compassionately and directly into Barb's eyes and gently said, you know what I would do if I were you, Mrs. Waltz? I'd buy my daughter the prettiest little pink shoes I could find with purple shoelaces. Barb knew what he meant. Ed said, we talked about our experience on the way home. Both doctors had told us the same thing. Our little daughter, Deb, would never walk. I'm ashamed to say what we felt like doing to the first doctor. But I can tell you, we felt like hugging the second one. Gently speaking the truth makes a difference in how truth is received. Did you catch that? Gently speaking the truth makes a difference in how truth is received. So, we're at the bottom of our outline today, and here's the question. It's a very simple question. My gentleness, your gentleness, our gentleness, is it evident to all? You know, the Paul actually in another passage says we are to clothe ourselves with gentleness. Are you wearing your gentleness well? Do you need to bring it out of the closet? When people meet you, or let's ask this hard question. When people know they're going to meet you, are they looking forward to it or are they dreading it? Now the question is, you go, well, I don't know. Well, I want you to look at the quote here by Randy Frazee, because this is your discipleship homework for the week. Okay, get ready. Here's your discipleship homework. Very simple one. Very hard, I might add. Randy Frazee says, if we want to know the true measure of our gentleness, oh, here's the kicker, we have to ask others. So, may I gently inquire, will you ask someone this week?